Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and I'm so excited about this week's special guest. She's one of the very rare people privileged to have come back to be on the show twice, and her name is Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome, Isabel.
I'm feeling suitably flattered now.
No, you're great. As you know, you are one of my honorary wives. You're that special. I see you on Question Time sometimes, and I think, oh, she is so sound. You really are. And I think a lot of men feel that way. Well, women too. They think she's going out to bat for the truth. She's speaking conservative truths fearlessly. So thanks for that.
What is so difficult is that after a programme like Question Time, the feedback that you get from people is so binary that you can almost lose your way between these two polar opposites. So I always get a barrage of emails through my website, and about 2/3 of them, perhaps that's being generous to myself, probably about 2/3 though, are "you are wonderful, keep pushing on, thank goodness that you're standing up for what no one else wants to say." And the other third are "what a vile, nasty, bitter woman you are." And after you've had quite a volume of this stuff, you do slightly start wondering whether you're anywhere in the middle of those two things, and is there a possibility that you might be the worst interpretation?
Do they ever try and psychoanalyze you? Do they talk about your unhappy childhood?
Oh, I get a bit of that. I do get a bit of that. You must not have been loved enough as a child. Yeah, that doesn't cut too deep, because you know what? I had a really, really nice, secure childhood. It was not a privileged one. There are all sorts of assumptions people make, and I did grow up in a pretty eccentric setup, but one thing we did have was stability.
It's nice, isn't it, when you've got an area where you feel that when you feel bulletproof, because I know what you're saying about the hate mail, that sometimes you think, well, hang on, have they got a point? Right,
absolutely. Maybe I am a bit nasty, or maybe there's something wrong with my expression when I'm talking on TV that makes me look as if I'm bitter, because I'm just not bitter at all. I'm really happy.
The secret for dealing with comments like that, I find, is to just look at the profile of the person who's saying it, if you can.
Oh, and more often than not, they don't even dare tell you who they are. If they're on Twitter, they don't tell you who they are. Though one thing I do find curious is often the most utter vile correspondence I get comes complete with names and phone numbers, as if I had one last week, which I had one or two like this that actually wished me dead. Now, I mean, this is pretty extreme stuff. I hope that you suffer a lot and then you die, something along those lines, and complete with full name and a telephone number, and you sort of slightly wonder whether they think you might ring them up and maybe exchange a bit of banter,
No, it's called, Ismail, I can tell you, it's called negging. It's a classic pulling technique. There was a book written about it. And if there's somebody you fancy, you this is an extreme version. You give them a death threat.
I'm wondering where this is going now.
You leave your phone number, and they think, oh, I'm curious.
Yeah.
Who could this interesting man with lots of hinterland be?
Well,
he likes killing people.
It's fair to say it didn't quite work out like that. Although one thing I have found is that whilst I don't engage with the really extreme ones, the ones that wish me dead, if you reply to ones that are pretty hostile to you, but nonetheless have stopped short of wishing you cancer or ill for your children, and you're quite measured in your reply, and you acknowledge that you're quite divisive, and you say, actually, you know what, I think my role on these programmes that I'm incredibly lucky to be invited on, my role isn't to be vanilla on there. It isn't to just agree with the liberal consensus. It is to throw out a few punches and to put an alternative point of view. And by the way, I know that I do come across as quite objectionable. I accept that. But this is how this is what I do. They then come back quite kind of almost quite bashful and sort of rather retreating and saying, sorry, maybe I could have been a bit more moderate in the way I expressed my message to you. And thank you so much for replying. I never imagined that you would take the time to do that. And actually quite disarming for those people that you engage with them. And the trouble is that nobody has got the time to engage with all of those people, but rather validating to have that discussion and both of you to emerge from it feeling better.
Yes, I agree. It's a question of time though, isn't it?
Yeah.
But people do feel chastened when you reveal yourself to be a human being.
Totally.
Because they
I
think you're
do
a
wonder,
cockroach.
Absolutely, and I may have cockroach elements, but I don't have all the characteristics of a cockroach. So if I've only got a couple of cockroachy characteristics, honestly, I think most people do. They just hide them.
If you were a cockroach, of course, every time you got squashed, 1,000 more would appear out of the wreckage.
Sadly, there aren't. Well, maybe in fact, I'm sure to everyone's great relief, there aren't 1,000 of me.
I was wondering, actually, since we're on the subject of nasty comments, whether you've noticed generally an increase in the unpleasantness of the left in social media and stuff. I'm thinking of the Alexandria shootings. They seem to me to be partly a consequence of some really, really unpleasant language being used on social media, etc., and indeed in some newspapers about right-wing people.
I think it was always there, but I think that certainly in this country, Corbynism has brought the worst out of it. So when I get particularly unpleasant messages on Twitter and have a look at where they've come from, they tend to come from people who call themselves Red Corbyn or, Marxist Marcher or, something like that, typically without actually saying who they are, but some kind of very political left-wing identity there. And it appears to be entirely acceptable. Now, what do we put this down to? I mean, there are really serious questions here, and this is not me saying anything particularly original or profound, but those people must seriously feel that somebody with an accent like mine and views like mine has had so much given to them which they could never have had access to, that we deserve nothing but disdain for our unbelievable privilege and assumption of rectitude.
I tell you what I've noticed. 10 years ago, no one would have called somebody like me a Nazi or extreme right or far right. It just wouldn't. I just simply don't fit the definition, and nor do you. Now I find that routinely, I find Corbynistas referring to me as somebody. Contacted me on Facebook the other day and said they'd been in a pub in Manchester talking to some young people, and they'd said, "Yeah, James Delingpole, he's a fucking Nazi." And they meant it, that I was a Nazi. And on Twitter again, I get called extreme right, far right.
Yeah.
This would not have happened before.
There's not really any room for subtleties here, is there? This goes back to what I was saying about the feedback I get. I mean, I don't get much in the middle. It's all either you're absolutely ghastly or you're a star and keep going. I don't know, that there isn't actually a desire on the part of these people that use extreme, very polarised put-downs like that to dig at all beneath the surface. For example, I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in corporal punishment. I actually believe in votes.
A lot of men are going to be very disappointed hearing that as well.
We'll not go there. I would back votes for prisoners, all of which are sort of, they're not,
Squishy
classic.
liberal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, but there's a desire to put people in a box. And the thing I think that frustrates me absolutely most, and it is a bit of a boring theme, so we shouldn't talk about it long, but it's the assumptions that people make on the basis of, a lot of assumptions are made on the basis of my name, including my middle name, which is quite flowery. The fact that I'm distantly related to a Lib Dem peer, people tend to think that I got my job because of him, even though I never even met him until I came to work at the House of Commons, and actually had absolutely no help getting my way crawling and up the career ladder. I didn't have any help from anyone. What I did have, and what they write about, is an amazing education.
Do you think with hindsight your parents would have been better off christening you Sharon?
I'm so glad that they didn't.
Sharon,
it's an advantage to have an unusual name.
Tracy Oakeshott.
I don't think you've moved with the times, James. I think you need to be called sort of Miami or something now.
You're right. I think, didn't I read somewhere that the name, that nobody last year was called Gary? Nobody in the whole country was christened Gary.
Really?
It's gone that.
What's wrong with Gary?
It's probably the same with Sharon and Tracy.
Yeah.
This is just dating me as a creature of the
totally
80s when
is.
they were the stereotypical chav.
Absolutely.
The word chav didn't exist in those days either.
Absolutely. No, you need to move on to I don't know, It's not even Chablis or Chardonnay anymore. It's definitely Miami.
We're going to talk in a moment about the shambolic state of Conservative politics and where we are and what your predictions are for the future. But I was just wondering...
By the way, my predictions are always absolutely rubbish. I'm actually sort of going to have to resign from any prediction games because I just don't get them right.
Well, I think that people can listen to your predictions and know they're not going to happen, and then they can infer
they can
from
go
that
for the opposite.
What will happen? I had a piece in this week's Spectator talking about, well, it said, I'm sorry to say this, but I totally understand why so many kids voted for Jeremy Corbyn. But it wasn't really a piece about Corbyn, it was more a piece about the failure of conservatism to find a message which is remotely exciting, inspirational to young people. And I think what we've had under David Cameron, under, well, really every Conservative party arrangement since the days of Thatcher is a form of squishy corporatism, soft political correctness, and I don't think that's enough of a conservative message to inspire anyone. Like, we can be like the left, only a bit more efficient. It's not going to work.
I would agree with you on that one, and I think that one of the issues in this recent election was, I mean, this has been observed by everybody really, was the sort of taking for granted that young people wouldn't vote, and that turned out to have very serious consequences. But if you think about what people in their 20s now have grown up with, they don't really particularly remember the Blair years. They may not have been very politically aware during those years. So what they might remember is the second half of Cameronism, insofar as there was any Cameronism. The very early Cameron was quite inspiring in a way. I mean, we can argue about how much of those ideas were his ideas, but he did have, the whole thing of compassionate conservatism and, environmental stuff, which I know you curl your lip at, but was repositioning the Conservative Party in a different space, and then the big society and all of that. So there were some exciting ideas there. Whether or not you agreed with them, they were something a bit different.
I think they weren't exciting.
There was something positive about those. Then, of course, Cameron gets in, and all it is austerity. And during that long period of austerity, because Conservatives are so instinctively convinced that austerity is the right thing to do, that seems to have taken up all the space for thinking about what other arguments we should be making. And what worries me is that Corbyn's near victory, it wasn't a victory, he failed, but his alarmingly close, how close he came to getting there, tells me that we failed to in any way confront the argument about free stuff being a good, free stuff really being free. I'm probably not putting this very well, but what I'm trying to say is that Conservatives have stopped selling a kind of the whole opportunity and aspiration argument, the kind of, the Dragon's Den thing, that you can come up with an idea and make something of yourself. And that's, to me, what's exciting about being a Conservative. I
think you've nailed it. That's absolutely it. You're a young person. You've left university with your, actually, frankly, pretty worthless degree.
Yeah.
You're 30 grand or more in debt. You can't get onto the housing ladder unless you score a kind of a 1 in a million job in the city or something, although even in the city you can't make as much money as you used to. How are you going to be inspired by the Conservative Party's message that, we care about social justice too, and we believe in political correctness? It's not enough of a unique selling point defining you in opposition to what Corbyn's message is.
I mean, if you think about what Blair did with New Labour and how, I remember the excitement of 1997 and, how he, they were, that whole quote from Mandelson who said I think it was Mandelson, supremely relaxed about people being stinking rich,
Yeah.
that to me is what, not in those framed in those words, but we need to be getting across the message that life is so much better if you can make something of yourself rather than hope for the state to pick you up and to push you along. And I think as a party, I'm not actually a member of the Conservative Party, though I'm talking as if I am, but let's just take that as an assumption that my sympathies are with the Tory party. We have failed to get across that message of opportunity and aspiration and hope, and you really can build a small business from nothing.
Yep.
And we go through the motions of that. I'm sure the Department for Business or whatever the hell it's called nowadays would be able to give you any number of press releases where they boringly set out these things. But we don't do it in any way that resonates with voters.
One thing it does do is make our job easier when we go on, when rather mainly you, when you go on Question Time. You don't feel at all that you have to shill for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party is so shit at the moment that it's so easy to attack them, isn't it?
I'm just not going to make any excuses. I just think I feel that there has been a collective complacency. I don't think that I have made any contribution to stop that happening, so I'm going to include myself in the failure, though I'm not a politician. But there's been a complacency that the argument about opportunity and aspiration and making something of yourself was long ago won. And, that Blair sort of did that for us. He neutralised socialism and the kind of strident Marxist sort of belief system. And that since Blair, we don't have to bother with those arguments anymore because everybody agrees that. We've banked it. We've taken that as a given. And what Corbyn's rise shows us is that absolutely can no longer be taken for granted. And I think that what this result has shown me as a journalist is that the traditional system of undermining a politician and party by attacking the individual, so Corbyn or equally Diane Abbott, and exposing their crazy sort of past beliefs and their affiliations with questionable characters, to put it mildly, and their complete inability to grasp the numbers. All of that, even bits of that, traditionally should have been enough to stop people voting for them. And in actual fact, people parked that. They were like, they didn't seem to care that Corbyn was an IRA sympathiser, or he called Hamas his friends, or Diane Abbott doesn't know the difference between 10,000 and 100 million. People parked that and they voted for them anyway. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that they're voting for the idea, not the people who are going to implement them. And we as Conservatives failed to put forward a robust attack of the ideas that Corbynism espouses and present an exciting alternative.
You're listening to the James Delingpole podcast with me, the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, with my very special guest, Isabel Oakeshott. More dissing the Tories in a moment.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for women and men, like t-shirts, baseball tees, tank tops, hoodies, and hats, or an unapologetically American belt buckle. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more, so get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Isabel Oakeshott. We were talking about how the Conservatives in Britain really don't have a message which is inspiring. And you said that you felt partly responsible for this.
I did not say that. That was massively bigging myself up. All I said is that it's no good for me to sit here complaining about what everyone else should have done.
Yeah.
And then I have to acknowledge that maybe as a commentator, I could have been putting forward these messages, and I haven't been. Okay. So I'm just saying, I'm not sitting here just carping from the cheap seats.
Can I just say that while you have acknowledge a certain degree of guilt. I have not a shred of guilt about this. I have been totally advocating small government, free markets, personal responsibility for as long as I remember. And my
Yeah, but it's not good enough
It
for...
is.
No, hang on. It's not good enough for people like you and me. You are, I'm going to say, you are quite a few years older than me. But nonetheless, we are both too old to
What do you
be
say?
any kind of symbol of hope for anybody. We need to be much smarter than that. It's no good for... people like us to sit there and riff in the columns of The Spectator or anywhere else. We actually have to find younger people who can convey this. I mean, look at someone like Owen Jones. I think he's a fantastic example
He's a propagandist. He's brilliant.
of a commentator who actually is changing things. It's not actually
In a bad way.
It's not how I ever envisaged my job was going to be, and so maybe this is something that could be embraced for the future.
Actually, can I just take issue with that? Owen Jones, I quite. If I were gay, I would definitely want to shag or be shagged by Owen Jones. I think
James,
he's no.
Crying
I
out
think
loud.
he's. I think
Have you
he's.
noticed you do have a tendency to bring sex into this discussion approximately once every 3 minutes?
I'm just warming up to.
Isn't it every
I'm
7
saying
minutes
I
that
can
men
see.
think about sex?
I can see
Every
why.
7. If somebody actually goes through this and times it, I think you'll see that James brings up sex about every 7
Isabel,
minutes.
not only are you my honorary wife, you are sounding like my wife. In fact, you are sounding like wives across the country. Can you just let me finish develop my point, which is quite an interesting one, which is that I recognise Owen Jones's personal charms. I think in the green room he's very a nice, polite boy. On TV, he's articulate in the sense that he connects words together in a convincing and smooth way, even though he talks almost as much bollocks as Diane Abbott does. He just does it in a slightly more lucid way. When you look at his books, Chavs, an analysis of the white working class, which is actually bears no relation to the reality. Look at what's happening. For example, look at what Tommy Robinson is doing in the inner cities right now. Look at the marches. Where is Owen Jones supporting the white working class on marches like this, on issues of real concern to them? He's not. He's supporting the very causes which are opposed to these people.
Yeah, but James, I think you're missing the point here. Perhaps rather than attack Owen Jones, who I think is a very impressive figure, and you're absolutely right. More than being impressive, he's extremely likeable. Perhaps the question you should be asking is, where are the right-wing equivalents?
No, I'm not going to buy this, Isabel. I'll tell you why. Owen Jones gets a free fucking pass from the BBC. He really does. He's on every BBC.
Yeah, but you'd find a right-wing equivalent would get the same.
Not true. Simply not true. The odds are so stacked
let's try and
against.
create one, shall we, and see what happens.
I've reached the point where I so despair of the BBC and Channel 4.
This is so boring. You know what? People like you don't half bang on about the BBC, and I see it as a false enemy. In no way do I set the BBC up as something that we need to be fighting. I know it's an absolute kind of...
You go out and fight the fight on Question Time, and you are. They want you. They love you because you are an articulate, conservative-ish woman. So you press all the buttons for, and they haven't got many on their books, and that's good. But generally, if you are on the right, your job at the BBC is to be shat on and mocked. You are the token loon to be donutted by a Lib Dem, a communist, and a Marxist. That's only a slight exaggeration of what goes on.
I don't mind that. I suppose the point you're making is that it's all set up to present you as being the extreme element of the whole thing, rather than that being at all reflective of a mainstream consensus.
More than that, we could all be articulate, persuasive Owen Jones in an environment which was so conducive to where you're feeling loved by the BBC. The BBC are in the background quietly applauding every word of Owen Jones.
I don't care what they think. I just go out there and use the platform.
Well, maybe you are almost autistic in your ability to rise above that. Because I've noticed, and I've seen so many conservative commentators do this on programmes like Any Question, Question Time. They moderate their opinions. They become slightly squishy in order to be liked by the audience. In order to fit into.
That.
No,
I
you don't.
don't mind being booed by the audience.
Yeah. But let me say, Isabel, that you really are the exception rather than the rule. So we're going to disagree on this one, obviously, but I would say it's definitely the case. You said why aren't conservative commentators going out there and changing the nature of the argument so that the young are inspired?
Yeah.
And I'm saying that the
You're saying
environment.
you're just giving a counsel of despair and saying it's all too difficult. That is basically what you're saying.
No, I'm not.
You
I'm
might
not.
be, you might be right.
No, I'm not.
But hang on, I'm just gonna pick you up on that, because your response to my argument was to talk about how the whole BBC setup makes it too difficult. I just don't buy into that. First of all, the assumption that you need the compliance of the BBC in order to be able to make a convincing argument. The remarkable thing about Owen Jones, and this probably should be the last we say about him because he's already dominated this conversation too much, is that he created a platform for himself, and that is what's so possible now. You don't need to be in the BBC.
Enable the BBC, and that's not true. What do you think of what percentage of of Britain's TV and radio do you think the BBC occupies? It's something like 80%. Its market saturation is in any other. If you were starting up again now, you would ban the BBC as a monopoly. And I'm not arguing for the banning of the BBC. What I am saying is that actually we need much more diversity. When I was travelling here and I wanted some speech radio, what options did I have? I had Radio 2. Radio 4.
Talk radio is becoming really big now. So look at something like LBC. Its ratings are really fantastic. You've got an increasing variety of platforms. Of course, I accept what you're saying in a kind of literal sense that the BBC does enjoy a huge market share, but I don't accept that should be a reason why people presenting a right of centre argument can't get their point across in other ways.
Look, I can go on the Nick Ferrari show on LBC and I will reach a significant London audience. But it's not the same audience you reach when you're... let's take Radio 4 as an example. When I'm travelling along in my car, I quite often turn to Radio 4 because I have this expectation.
There was me thinking that you listen to, I don't know, Six Music or whatever it's called, Samantha Cameron's cool radio choice.
Do you know my problem?
Radio.
I haven't got one of those digital things where I can get Six Music. So I tend to listen to... Funnily enough, I often listen to Radio 1. And the reason I listen to Radio 1 is although that the
chat's actually quite good, I think.
The chat is inane. But the point is you get beats and stuff. What you don't get is mostly dumbass politics. On the way here, for example, I turned to Radio 4. It's Woman's Hour. It's a whole hour of feminist drivel. Now, there's no...
I'm sensing a trap here because I could say so much about Women's Hour and it would get me into all sorts of trouble.
On. Yeah, you do,
I'm now busy editing myself.
No, go on. Don't edit. Do not edit yourself.
I'm going to regret this,
Isabel,
but I'm really sorry. I find Jane Garvey really annoying.
Yeah, count the ways. Go on, tell me more.
I'm okay with Jenny Murray, but I just cannot bear the way Jane Garvey has to put politically correct riders onto everything she says. So it could be, I'm going to come up with a really crap example here, but there are multiple examples. On any given day, you'll get it. She'll say something like, if you're at home now listening to this, and you're doing the washing up and preparing the children's stuff for school, and I should also say you could be a man doing that too. There is a constant...
Yeah.
Absolutely excessive lengths gone to not to offend anyone, and it just grates. That's all. I love Women's Hour, by the way. Please don't ban me from coming on Women's Hour because I really quite occasionally to come on Women's Hour. And by the way, Jenny Murray, I think you're bloody fantastic.
Yeah, you had to. Do you know what? The only podcast I have ever cancelled. I won't name the person's name, but I actually had to not use it because the person I know is really incredibly right-wing in person. And every time I tried to steer the conversation towards right-wing soundness...
nice right-wingery.
This person, I'm using the gender-neutral person, they pulled their punch. And I just thought, sod you. This is
that's
the
because
Delingpole
the
podcast, not the
yeah,
BBC
I
Radio
know,
4
I
Woman's
know,
Hour.
but the consequence of that. Okay, so now I've said that stuff about Jane Garvey, it will be, there will be someone who picks that up, and it will not do me any favours. And I'm really sorry. Jane Garvey does a really professional job, and I love Women's Hour, but she annoys me. That's all.
Jane Garvey tweeted me about 6 months ago after I'd tweeted something particularly vigorously anti-feminist and said, we haven't had you on Woman's Hour for a while. So clearly she's gagging for have me back on Woman's Hour. Now anyway, let's go away from Owen Jones and the BBC and let's talk about this Conservative problem. And who do we blame? I think you did put your finger on it at the beginning of the section when you said that it was partly your fault, and I accept that, and we agreed that I agreed that it was definitely not my fault. But I'm looking out there now at the world of Conservative journalism, and I feel very, very lonely. I could almost list to you now the journalists out there who are still being sound in. Okay, so there's Douglas Murray, Charles Moore. Help me here. Who else is there? It's a very lonely Christopher Booker-ish, apart from some odd views he has about the EU.
You're not going to say Fraser Nelson?
Fraser likes his metrics. Fraser always writes a good piece. I'd say if I were going to cite a sort of true Conservative, where I think Conservative journalism ought to be, I'd say much more other editor of the Sunday Telegraph. What's his name?
I mean, you're thinking here of hang on, Dominic Lawson. I mean, the Mail is full of good right-wing columnists.
Okay, so let's look at the Mail. Dominic Lawson, definitely.
Richard Littlejohn.
Littlejohn is a total hero. I love.
There you go.
No. Hang on a second. We've named 5 so far. Yeah. Okay.
Katie Hopkins.
We can. Yeah,
and
but
we're just let's not have
Katie,
this conversation dominated by Katie Hopkins.
No, I'm not. I think that Katie Hopkins is too often thrown to the wolves. Nevertheless, I wouldn't advance Katie Hopkins as one of the great voices of conservatism because A, she's too much of a shock jock, and B, economically she's not always sound. She hasn't got a grand unified theory of conservatism. She's very strong on certain issues. But if you talk to Katie about the evils of quantitative easing, for example,
have you tried it?
I probably have.
James, this should be a challenge for you. Have you asked her onto the podcast?
She's been on the pod. She was actually my first podcast guest, and I'll tell you about Katie Hopkins.
Did you like her?
I like Katie very much, and I think she is much maligned. I think
She wants to be maligned.
Like a lot of successful people. I mean, I think of Milo, for example. She doesn't have much loyalty. She'll jettison you as soon as there's not much of a kind of. Douglas Murray, for example. Douglas Murray has always got your back. If he's in the foxhole next to you, he's not going to retreat and expose your flank. I mean, you are solid. I'd say with Katie, with Milo, with so many kind of celebrity people, it's all about them.
What has happened to Milo? He's sunk without trace.
No, he hasn't. Milo goes from strength to strength. Do you know when
invisibly?
No, when the Milo story broke about him being harassed because of being monstered because of something he said about gay sex or something.
Yeah. Here we go. That's you've actually gone past the 7-minute thing. You've gone to like 10 minutes between the last mention of the sex thing.
You brought up the subject of Milo.
I didn't say anything about sex.
Yeah, but that was the thing that supposedly undid him, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and I didn't even bother sending him an email saying, "Mate, I hope you're all right in this difficult time," because I knew that Milo would turn it to his good. Because what happened was this: Simon & Schuster cancelled his book contract for which he got about 150, 250,000.
250 grand,
okay,
yeah.
Milo was going to make way more than that now from direct sales. So we had the marketing campaign conducted by Simon & Schuster before they cancelled the contract. Then we had the double marketing campaign of the cancellation. He's going to monetize that book like nobody's business now. He's probably going to make $1 million out of it, isn't he?
Well, I would have thought so. And actually, I mean, did you read the detail of what undid him?
No.
It's worth reading. I don't think we should go into it here because it's just all too delicate. But I think a lot of it was deliberately taken out of context by people who hate Milo.
Duh.
Of course it was.
You don't say.
Yeah.
It was done by, I think, launched, wasn't it, by a bunch of Never-Trumpers, by the
you
Reagan
just-
Battalion, I
The
think.
thing is, you can't say this stuff, and he knows that, and he says it anyway, and then you've got to take the consequence. So,
Well, also, as a gay man who's had his experiences, perfectly entitled to express views about male sexuality. You think about the Spartans. Think about the culture from back then, or think about the what was that elite unit which was ended up being defeated by Alexander. The sacred.
This is where Delingpole gives Oakeshott a history lesson, and
Okay.
Oakeshott zones out and looks at the very pretty geraniums and
Do you know?
roses.
Do you know about the sacred band?
This is all above my level.
Okay, no. Well, just briefly, the sacred band was this
Is
elite.
you showing off?
No, really not. This elite unit composed of older male lovers and younger male lovers,
Here we go
and
again.
they would fight to the death for the honour of their lover. So one of the reasons that they fought so well is they did it for love. Now, I'm not saying that we should return to the days of the sacred band or the Spartans' tradition of an older male lover and the sort of ephebe. Nevertheless, historically there's nothing too weird about what Milo was saying, and the idea that his career should be destroyed for voicing that opinion seems bizarre.
Well, I am going to tick the correct box here and say that of course you can't condone anything like that, and his mistake was to look like he did, but his career isn't destroyed, and as you say, he will reappear, and it will be, he will be an even bigger phenomenon than ever. So should we just park Milo?
Yeah, he'll be very upset by that. He'd prefer the rest of the.
Which bit? Me parking him?
He'd like to be the subject of the rest of this podcast, but we won't.
Yeah.
Bye bye, Milo. Off you go. Back
Yeah.
into your box. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my special guest, Isabel Oakeshott. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Paul in Connecticut, welcome to the show.
And I'm tired of banging my head against the wall. And every time you turn around, there's somebody else picking your pocket. It's insurance, it's taxes, it's regulations. I'm so sick of it. All they do is they hammer the people that want to get out there and do something every day, and they reward the people that stay home and do nothing. I'm beyond done with it. I've had it.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Isabel Oakeshott.
And if I can just paint you a little picture here, I'm actually sitting with my head in my hands because we're about to talk about Brexit, and head in hands is how I feel about Brexit right now.
Did you see? Well, in fact, you probably didn't, because I know you were out at some boring black tie event, but there was a fascinating programme on TV last night called Wife Swap Brexit
I heard
Special.
about this. I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, okay. So they had this passionate Brexit household and a passionate Remain household, and the wives swapped.
Oh, yeah.
So the passionate Brexit household had English flags bunting on the outside,
yeah.
and the Remainer household, the wife was this German woman. She was a psychotherapist, a green psychotherapist.
Oh, God.
And what struck me watching this programme, even though I obviously was a biased person, was how much better the Brexit people came across than
I'm going to have to watch this
the
on
Remainers.
catch up. Was this it wasn't a BBC thing, was it?
I think it's Channel 4.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely
Wives
watch
Swap.
that. It sounds like it could so easily have been set in this town, because just to give you an idea where we are, we're in West Oxfordshire, in a really gorgeous little town
Lovely.
on the edge of the Cotswolds, and it's an extraordinary little place because it's incredibly political. Now, you might imagine that it's true blue, and in fact, David Cameron was our MP here, and the successor to David Cameron, Robert Courts, has just done very, very well in his result in the general election. When he stood in the by-election, when Cameron stood down, he actually went right down to quite a low majority, actually, which is a reflection of the sheer scale of Lib Demery in this part of the world. But what's extraordinary about this town is if you wandered around, you would find there are a whole load of people who so haven't given up the whole EU thing. This town is festooned with EU flags, and I keep wanting to just kind of put a little notice in their window just sort of saying, get over it, it's over. And then I'm thinking, maybe it isn't over.
Why do these people want to stay in the EU so much? Well, because it's not as though we haven't been presenting evidence over the year that the EU is corrupt, sclerotic, anti-democratic, probably conducive to the wars that it allegedly stopped over the last
Right. There's a
50
house
years.
down the road from ours which has got a giant, and I mean giant, EU flag hanging out of the window. And more often than not, that EU flag is all twisted round the flagpole, and you can hardly actually see the flag at all. You can just see this kind of scrunched up piece of material. And whenever I pass it, I always think that is an utter symbol for the EU. It's in a twist. It can't even display itself at its best.
What do you think that they think we're getting out of the EU?
You know what? I just don't know.
No.
I don't know. I think they think, oh, I could maybe go and work in Spain if I wanted to,
Do you know
without it
what?
being too much hassle.
I almost fell out with some of all my posh friends were ardent Remainers, and I tried pushing them on this, on why it was that they felt it mattered so much.
Yeah.
And about the best they could come up with was that their children had all been to schools like Eton and
Might want to
Westminster
go and
and
work
stuff.
in Italy.
Might want to go work in Italy, darling.
I told you. That is what
That's
a
what
lot
it
of them
comes
are
down to.
basically thinking.
Which is just
Um,
like toffee selfishness, isn't it? It's not even that they're so insulated from the
I mean,
consequences
there
of EU
may
membership.
actually be 101 good reasons to be in the EU, but one of the reasons that the Remain campaign lost is that they didn't tell us what they were. But I don't think we should sort of rehash the whole thing. I think the question is, what happens now, and to what extent is Brexit really in peril? And that is what is occupying about 70% of Westminster parlour talk at the moment. The other percent, the 30 remaining percent, is how long can Theresa survive, and if there's another general election soon, are we going to get a Corbyn government?
Oh God, that is you've opened up a can of worms so enormous that they're like wriggling all over us, and I'm quite frightened. So to help me here, what's going to happen?
Well, I think that, Theresa is fatally damaged, no doubt about that. She, as George Osborne tremendously helpfully pointed out, she's on death row. But there's an absolute terror, and rightly so, of another election anytime soon. And so, ironically, she's going to be propped up by everybody who really wants her gone, but thinks that it's too dangerous not to have her. I mean, I spoke to somebody last night who, a very senior person in the government, who thought that she would have to stay for the 2 years, the full 2 years. I'm not sure whether she can last that long. I think we're in a really difficult place now, where every bad thing that happens, whether it's a terror attack, or whether it's
fire,
a house, a high-rise block burning down, or whether it's somebody being run over, and I'm not, by the way, trying to say that all those things are of equal level of tragedy, but absolutely all bad stuff that happens is now being presented by the media in the within the framework of it being a consequence of Tory austerity or Theresa May being shit.
Yes.
And that is a very bad place to be, because, oh my God, it's so easy to make that story about everything. I mean, you can make that story about a kid being run over on the road outside of this house. Well, that's Tory cuts, we should have put a zebra crossing there. Try and name me something bad, apart from the weather, perhaps, but even storms can be seen through a prism of failing to invest in flood defences. There's virtually nothing bad that can happen which we can't all blame on Tory austerity.
So, if there is a leadership contest, who's going to win? Boris is obviously going to be one of the people.
It's so difficult to call these things, because I would have never said Theresa May. I am a bit disillusioned by Boris. I adore Boris. I fall for Boris every time. I think he's great company. I'd love to have him around for a dinner party,
Or in a taxi.
I do get on very well with Boris. I like to think I do. But do I want him as Prime Minister? The reason is no, is because I think he's just too flaky on issues, and he just veers he's too unpredictable. I think David Davis is the obvious one to inherit the crown, but Davis is very divisive within the party, and I'm not sure that he is sufficiently attractive to the wider electorate. I think he's absolutely competent and would probably be quite brilliant in many ways, but I would worry that he's too divisive within his own party. The person I sort of think, here's a kind of like a left field argument. What about Graham Brady?
Don't know anything about him.
Well, there you go. So that is probably the reason that would be dismissed. But then not many people knew about David Cameron before he came up through the ranks. So Brady is the chairman of the 1922 committee, which is like the kind of union of Tory backbenchers. He is a staunch Brexiteer.
I like him already.
He has an interesting backstory. I think he's very much a grammar school boy. And he is thoroughly nice. So the advantages that he has are that he is very popular within the party because he's chairman of the 22. He is Eurosceptic, and he has some ministerial. I think actually he may not have been a minister. He's certainly been a shadow minister. And I think he ticks a lot of boxes. The difficulty will be people will say he doesn't have enough profile.
What about... I quite like Priti Patel.
Wow, interesting thought.
She's
great.
She's bright and she's right wing.
Yeah, she's
and
absolutely great.
She's a girl.
Yeah.
And she's what is her ethnic background? I mean, she's
I don't know,
Indian or Pakistani, British, but
I think Priti Patel is great, and I would be entirely happy to see her
she's
in
quite
the
hot as
down
well.
to the.
Not
For
that that's
God's
no, not
sake.
no, but some of us these things matter.
A full 7 minutes has passed, and he's back. This guy is deprived.
Don't say that.
Paging Delingpole's wife.
It's not true, actually.
He's gone red, by the way. By the way, everybody.
No,
He's actually blushing.
I'm
He's
actually blushing at the insult to my wife, who
Not an insult to your wife.
doesn't deprive me at all.
It's an insult to
No. Priti Patel, she'd be good, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
Is she
I'm not going to.
where was she on Brexit?
She was part of the Leave campaign.
She was totally sound.
Yeah. No, I think she's a possibility. I can't see her for some reason. I just can't see her making it to the final cut. I don't think she's got enough of a following within the parliamentary party. Because remember, you've got to have a base level of popularity. Not that was a particular problem for Andrea Leadsom getting to the final lot.
Please don't say Amber Rudd.
No, I'm not going to say Amber. I really like Amber, and I think she's been very competent, but I don't think she's got any kind of extra selling point.
Right.
And she's a Remainer, so no.
So is there going to be... when's it going to happen?
I just don't know. I don't know. Things look so bad for Theresa at the moment, but she is saved by the fact that no one... within the parliamentary party wants to topple her right now. And
are we going to get, in these difficult times, are we going to get Brexit? Or hard Brexit, as it's sometimes known? Or are we going to get nothing? I mean, a cop-out?
So if nothing means falling out into WTO, I'd be quite happy with that. But I don't think that's what you meant. I think what you meant was some kind of weird, I don't know, economic area, special, some kind of weird fudge, which doesn't give us any real power to strike our own trade deals, which is the key thing, really. Totally. And I actually slightly... coming down from my obsession with immigration on the issue of leaving the EU, because I'm thinking on reflection that actually it's far more important for us to be able to control non-EU immigration than the EU variety. And I suppose I had thought, well, at least it's a start if we can control the EU legislation, EU immigration. But actually there's really sod all excuse for us not being able to control the other bits. If we could control the other half, and it is roughly half, then do you know what? Maybe we can live with a little bit, having some obligations which fall short of free movement.
I might have agreed with you had it not been for the fact that in 2015, Angela Merkel invited 1.2 million, 1.5 million people, mostly from the Middle East.
So you're saying non-EU become EU.
I'm saying that actually, let's talk about this briefly. One of the things that really surprised me about the election is that security and Islamism and terrorism barely got a look in. I mean, even after the appalling incident on London Bridge, okay, so Theresa May came out of number 10 and made some toughish noises, but nobody believed her. Why is it that people, given that this is what everyone's talking about privately, why is it that none of the main parties are really addressing this issue publicly?
Because they're scared. Because you get shouted down. Because if you say, actually, I just think there's too many... I'm not saying this because I'm too scared to.
Yeah.
But if you say, actually, there's just too many Muslims coming to live here and it is actually changing the culture of this country, you get absolutely shot down in flames.
Yeah. Well, I think if everyone read
Note that I
Douglas...
said if you say that.
If everyone read Douglas Murray's new book, they would have the ammunition to counter that argument. They would simply have the facts at their disposal. But you're absolutely right that politicians are incredibly cowardly on this issue.
Absolutely craven, and that is why people like, sorry to return to it, but Katie Hopkins resonate with so many people, because a lot of people are concerned. I think it's actually absolutely fine to question whether we want to have too much of a let me just crystallise this in an example. How do we feel in this country about, how do most people feel about having schools which are purely Muslim schools where everything is all about that culture and the children are actively discouraged, if not banned, from mixing with anybody outside that group? I think that is utterly insidious, and I can't believe that we allow it.
It ought not even to be negotiable. In fact, look, I was brought up to believe that one of the great things about living in Britain was that everyone had equality before the law. Well, once you have Sharia courts, that is clearly not the case.
But you know, I've said this about these exclusively Muslim schools, and people say, well, you know, what about exclusively Catholic schools? And my answer to that, or exclusively, you know, Church of England schools, my answer to that is, you know what, last time I checked, and I did actually have to check going through all the detail of this, we are actually still a Christian country.
Yes.
That is the setup here. And by the way, when was the last time a bunch of Church of England people blew everybody up on London Bridge or wherever it was?
It's definitely one of the standard responses of the liberal left, call them what you will, is that when you raise the subject of madrasa type schools, what you get is this: yes, I would ban all religious schools. Well, no, that's a cop out. We are a Church of England country. You look at the education that Catholic schools provide. My kids went to a C of E primary school. They did not get taught that Jews were pigs, and that Western girls were harlots. They didn't get taught any of this stuff. They didn't get the boys being separated from the girls. How are you going to get well integrated British children?
Well, you're just not.
You're
and
not.
I think we have to be a lot more. I'm sorry, we have to be a lot more aggressive about our attitude to assimilation. Now, if you look at, there are very few countries that haven't really been affected by jihadi activity, and one of them is Switzerland. And that's quite interesting because Switzerland actually has a really high rate of immigration. I think about 40% of the Swiss population is non-sort of native Swiss. But they are incredibly picky about who they let in, and they are really aggressive in their demands for assimilation. You can't come in unless you have not English, but unless you have certain language qualifications to a high level. We're not just talking pidgin here. We're talking actually having a good level of fluency in the language. And, you know, there are things that we can learn from that. I think we are far too tolerant. Sorry, I know it's not popular. We're too tolerant.
Well, I'm afraid if you listen to last week's podcast with Roger Scruton, he was very bleak on the subject. We were talking initially about how it is that we can persuade the populace that actually conservative values aren't so bad, and how can we explain to them that there are certain aspects of our civilization, which are worth defending. And he said, I'm afraid there's only one thing that shows people why their civilization is worth defending, and that is war. And it has been that way throughout history, that war concentrates the mind, and unfortunately we are entering a period where we are going to this is our third world war. We didn't. We thought it was going to be about Russian tanks, Soviet tanks rolling across Lüneburg Heath. It's not. It's going to be about a permanent insurgency.
It's a war of attrition, basically, and it's very, very difficult to fight it because, what can you do about random nutters who go out and kill people with kitchen knives
and who blow up? You would have thought that the death or mutilation of 80 girls at an Ariana Grande concert would have been the line in the sand for everyone.
But wasn't, though, because it took another thing for Theresa May to use that ghastly phrase, enough is enough. That really annoyed me. I thought, so was Manchester not enough then?
Yes.
Or which bit of the other things that happened weren't enough? The beheading of Lee Rigby or any other number of ghastly things. And then she waits for another tragedy and then says enough is enough and then promises to do things that she could very, very well have done while she was in the Home Office.
I think we're going to reach the point. This is a brief digression, but it'll make sense. I used to interview World War II veterans, and one of the veterans I interviewed was a chap who'd spent time in an Italian POW camp in the winter of 1943, I think. It was a particularly cold winter, and the prisoners were dying like flies of malnutrition. And he said, in the early days, when somebody died, they'd have a parade, and everyone would say farewell to this person. And after a time, so many people started to die that people started to say things like, put him in the soup. People got so cynical about deaths that it became a commonplace. I think we are going to reach a point where you're not even going to bother having minute silence for the latest.
Sure.
And Scruton mentioned nuclear bomb. I think a dirty bomb is a possibility. I think we've got way to go before our political class wakes up.
And there are endless further horrors. I mean, it occurred to me, there's an endless range of possibilities for implementing this type of warfare on us. I mean, it actually occurred to me with this awful tower block thing. I'm surprised that terrorists haven't thought of dousing a tower block in petrol at the bottom and setting it alight. What a new an imaginative.
Well, particularly now we know
that
they're clad in flammable eco material.
I mean, but there's endless number of vulnerabilities, aren't there? And we can't actually protect ourselves from them all. But I don't think that we're doing nearly enough to stop it growing up from within us.
Look at the response of the police so far. We had Cressida Dick, who one feels probably got the job, not partly at least because she fitted the right gender profile. Cressida Dick, what was her comment in the aftermath of London Bridge? Did you see this?
What was her comment?
She praised the diversity of the victims. This was her take-home message. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful sign that they came from. Obviously, there was the Australian nanny who got a throat cut, and there was a Romanian who helped attack the terrorists, and this was this is the mentality.
What was the point she was making?
Well, you may well ask. This is the mentality of the senior levels of police, and I wanted also to point out the comment of the police commissioner in Devon and Cornwall, who said that she could conceive of a situation where people with shotguns were called in to help defend the community, and she instantly got sat on by her assistant chief constable of Devon, saying we would prosecute with the full force of the law any citizens who took the law into their own hands. So you've got this.
I mean, this is all. It's all a nonsense, isn't it? It's all a nonsense.
I'd say I sometimes talk to Americans about this, and they are astonished that obviously we don't have a Second Amendment, but they look at us and say, well, isn't one of the basic duties of any government to protect its citizenry?
Absolutely.
And if they are not doing that, then the citizens have a right to ask themselves, well, why can't we defend ourselves?
Yeah, I don't know about. I mean, I think actually I probably have a different point of view from you on this. I am glad that we have very few guns here, and I think that it's a testament to that the attackers on London Bridge didn't kill nearly as many people as they would like to have done, because they had to resort to pathetic instruments of pain and wounding vis-a-vis basically a kitchen knife. If they could have, how awful would it be if they're able to get hold of guns?
Well, I agree. If they had
it's really bloody hard to get a gun
automatic
here.
Rifles, like Belgium is awash with. I agree.
Well, one thing that being an island does make it rather easier to control what's coming in.
Yeah. I'm sorry to end up our podcast on this depressing note, but sometimes I think these things come out. I find I did a wine podcast the other day.
How come I don't get these good gigs? You know, this is just I mean, you've got some slightly cold coffee and I've got some cold tea, and that's it. It's my fault.
Yeah,
I suppose.
with the wine podcast, we had a bottle of dry sherry and it was great.
Sounds seriously middle-aged, bordering on pensive.
The sound quality deteriorated towards the end, and possibly
just the sound quality. I just thought the overall quality.
But nevertheless, we kept it light all the way through until we finally got on the subject of wine growing in the Middle East, in Lebanon and so on, and Turkey. Yeah. And suddenly we mentioned the thing that no one wants to talk about because it's so bloody depressing. So can we end by Can you tell me something nice, something fun, something that makes you happy? What about the return of Gove? Is that a good thing?
The return of Gove is always a good thing.
Yeah,
absolutely,
Gove,
always a good thing. And initially I was thinking, well, environment's a bit of a backwater, and that is absolutely not a cue for you to go off on one of your anti-green rants.
You're a stupid bloody greenie. I'm not going to go there.
But thinking about it, common agricultural policy is going to be massive, a huge issue over Brexit. So it's good to have someone in there. Absolutely, it is. I'm not sure is this a sufficiently cheering note to end on, but
if you're a fisherman, if you're a British fisherman, it is. Are we going to get our territorial waters back?
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. On that jolly fishy note, we will end our podcast. Thank you, Isabel Oakeshott, my very special guest. You listen to me, James Delingpole, on the Delingpole podcast. Thank you and goodbye.